I was really excited to put this episode out. I've been thinking about this episode for quite some time. I know that my schedule's been a little bit wonky ever since my grandma passed, but I think it's getting a little bit more back on track. I'm going to start putting out more content on Instagram and on TikTok, specifically the podcast reels that I do, where it's just clips of me talking to people. I haven't really put out a lot of those in a little bit of time because I have to do everything myself. All the social media accounts, it's all just me. So it does take quite some time for me to get into a groove or a rhythm of being able to put out stuff, especially since I have college. So I'm going to be graduating pretty soon, and you know what I mean. So on Spotify too, if you guys check it out, I do ask questions under every episode. Under the I Got Stabbed 32 Times episode, I had Mr. Raphael say, great episode as per usual, brother. I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate Mr. Raphael's following and appreciation for my content since day one. I really appreciate you too, brother. And under I Am Immortal, I had a question that said, do you believe that he's immortal? And I had Mr. Carlo say, and I quote, I don't believe him. He talks about it very broadly and lacking detail, but not only that, he doesn't talk like he felt anything throughout those points in time. There are no romanticized memories. And Carlo, good point, I would say. But I'd also say that if you had lived for 600 years like that guy claimed to, and yes, it's true, go check out that episode if you don't believe me. I don't think that you would be very emotional, very surprised. I mean, even when you're in like your 50s and 60s, you kind of get bored sort of everything in life too, you know what I mean? So, but I don't know. Who knows? I just know that this episode's a banger, and I hope you guys enjoy it.
Yo, Jack Flex, answer the fucking phone, dude.
Hello.
Jack.
I feel like I've interviewed so many different people at this point, different walks of life, different crazy experiences. I know that your parents are actually brother and sister.
Yeah.
Um, I think the first question that I have is right now in present day, how does that make you feel knowing this?
I don't know. It depends on the day. Some days it doesn't even cross my mind, and other days I fix on it way too much.
When's the last time you fixated on it?
2 weeks ago, maybe.
When you fixate on it and you're thinking about it, what's like the first couple things that come to your mind that you think of? Because there's just so much. Like, like where do you start?
That depends on the day too. I mean, yeah. So I have depression and anxiety. So, there's always stuff in the back of my head. And just some days it comes to the forefront, and it's whether it's how I came to be, whether it's the drama, of meeting my birth mother and what happened there, and the family dynamic, it depends on what I'm doing. As I fixate on it, all that stuff comes up, but it doesn't always start in the same spot. Everything kind of comes in eventually, like the whole history, you know what I mean? Like my whole 43 plus years of stuff.
And it's with these conversations when it comes to this family dynamic and level where things get incredibly complex. So I think that there's a quote, don't know who said it, but I'm sure we all heard it, that, it's something along the lines of art imitating life. And
Yeah.
I think that in books, a huge thing to really setting up a good plot and a good story, and making sure that we all really understand what's going on in the story, is to set up this plot or set up the characters. And
Okay.
In that same sense, I kind of want you to just kind of open up and just tell me the important figures in your family to start off with. I guess we could start off with primarily your parents and their situation where they grew up and how you think that happened to begin with.
Well, I have two sets of parents. I'm adopted, so I have those, plus I have my birth parents. My birth parents, I grew up in Minnesota, a few hours away from the Twin Cities, so it wasn't exactly suburban, but it wasn't rural either. Grandpa was an engineer, grandma was a nurse, and that's about all I know. So I make assumptions, socioeconomic status and that kind of thing. My birth parents were brother and sister, and they were, depending on who I talked to, they were between 14 and 16. And then at the time of my birth, I had a 5-year-old aunt. So it was the 3 kids and mom and dad, and I think it was like a ranch style house in town, in a small town, not a big town or whatever. But I mean, I don't know much else about the family. That's kind of the gray area, like I don't know all the ins and outs of how the family worked, or like I said, socioeconomic status, or what they were like in the community, or like I don't know any specifics really about any of that.
So we're going to come back to them. So now I want to talk
All right.
about your adopted parents. How are they?
Great. I mean, they make mistakes like every family does, and they were married at 23. They were told they couldn't have kids. They adopted my sister from different family, different time, different everything. And then they adopted me like 6 months later. And then 8 years about after I was adopted, they ended up getting pregnant and had my baby sister. And we grew up on a farm, rural. My wife grew up on a dairy farm like farther away from a city than I did. So she never considered my farm rural.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's whatever. But grew up on a dairy farm. When I went to college, we were poor, but not us kids didn't know it because my mom worked outside the house. So her income helped pay for all the bills that the farm had. So, like my mom's income offset, going into debt and stuff with the farm. So we were poor, but we, the kids didn't know it. They didn't let us know it. You know what I mean? So like we didn't get extravagant gifts, but we didn't get crap either, So it was like if my mom didn't work outside the house, we would have lost the farm a long time ago, kind of thing.
What age were you when you got adopted?
It actually went through I was like 11 months old. So I was in a foster home till I was about 11 months.
So I'm assuming that you don't really have any recollection of.
No.
So when you grew up, did your parents immediately tell you that you were adopted, or?
Yeah, my sister and I were always told we were adopted. We didn't know all the ins and outs of it, unless we asked or whatever. But yeah, that's we always knew we weren't related. Did
your parents know that your parents were siblings?
Yeah, they were told when they adopted me in case something happened, because of what could happen when you're product of incest. They had to be warned in case there was medical expenses or whatever. Yeah, it was fully disclosed in the paperwork that they had.
Do your siblings have a backstory as in-depth as this too?
No, my older sisters, pretty much mom and dad didn't have a relationship. They were alcoholics, drug addicts, whatever. They couldn't take care of a kid, so they put her up for adoption. That's pretty much it, as far as I know, for her. To me, that's more normal than my story, I guess. My baby sister was born her biological daughter, so her story's regular.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I definitely think there's some levels to, your sister's story, but I think yours has, I think there's, what do they say? Onions have layers? Like,
Yeah.
A couple onions here, I'd say. Is your sister older or younger? The one that was adopted?
Older.
Okay, so you're the middle child.
Yeah.
Oh man, how did you find out that your parents were siblings? Did your parents disclose this to you, or?
Well, not at first. I mean, it's not like when you're 5 and you find out you're adopted, it's not really time and place kind of thing. It got to bugging me, and then 8th grade. So whatever age you'd normally be in 8th grade, we had to do an assignment for English class. How did your family get from where they're from to Minnesota? So like if you're German, how did Germans immigrate? If you're Irish, how did, And so I didn't know what the heck I was. And my sister always said that she was Dutch. So she knew her nationality, but I didn't.
So you approach your parents and tell them about this project, I'm assuming then, right?
Yeah.
How did they handle that? Is this the moment? How did this conversation go? Do you remember?
I can tell you exactly where we were, and yeah. So it was actually just my mom and I in the car, and I said, "Well, Christina always says she's Dutch. Why? What am I?" And she basically said she didn't know my nationality or didn't remember it or however she worded it, but she knew that they were brother and sister. And I was like, "Oh, okay." It dawned on me, but it didn't dawn on me. And I knew at this point in my life, I was already addicted to porn. And so I already had stories and stuff in my head that I heard and read and whatever. Immediately, my head went to all those stories. And, oh, okay, how did it happen? Why? And of course, I didn't ask my mom any of this stuff because she's not going to know the ins and outs, obviously. But yeah, that's where my head went. And the weird part of me was, so I went to the student teacher who was in charge of this assignment, and I said, well, I don't know my nationality, but, and I told her, and I said, so can I do my report on incest instead of, can I, instead of Germans or whatever, so it's like, looking back on it, I'm like, yeah, that was kind of stupid, but she's like, okay. I mean, it's funny because it's like, I'm sure in her couple of years, 3-4 years, whatever, of college before she became a student teacher, they didn't really touch on that subject. So, here I am like, oh, da-da-da, so matter of factly, like, okay, that part just is hilarious to me.
Brought up the porn addiction, which we're definitely going to get into, but I think the first question I have to ask before that is, how old were you, at this point?
13.
13, 14. Okay. So, when your mom told you this, did she just kind of lay it out flatly and then that was that? Did she expand, or she just let you kind of sit on that?
The only thing she really expanded about was they were teenagers. So that was another reason for the adoption. Other than that, she didn't say anything.
Did you ever get to meet your birth parents or interact with them?
Yeah, I met my birth mother, and she has 2 girls and a boy, and I met her 2 girls, and one of her girls at the time had 2 kids, and I met her 2 kids. So, and my great grandmother, I met her, but this was all in the same day, so it was a little overwhelming to say the least.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna come back to them in a little bit. Definitely want to see what she had to say. But so you had brought up porn addiction at this point, and when you were 13, 14, that's in what
so this would have been like early 90s.
So you had access to, I think that was kind of before the
that was before the internet. It was all like magazines and stuff like that. So
did that addiction, I think that finding out that information can definitely spur those habits to get worse and worse over time.
Oh yeah.
Did finding out this information, I know you had mentioned having depression, anxiety too. Did this kind of fuel a hardcore addiction to porn throughout your life?
It fueled everything. A lot of people who are adopted, even under normal circumstances, have problems with rejection and trust and all that stuff. So, I was already feeling, like I didn't belong anywhere. As an adolescent, I was struggling. Didn't have many friends, didn't really feel right in my family and all that stuff that anxiety brings with it. Having this just kind of fueled that even more, like, oh well, I really wasn't wanted, or really, I'm really messed up in the head because of this. And then with the porn addiction, it made me go farther into like the taboo porn, to the extent I'd be reading like a textbook on incest or sexual abuse or whatever, and it would actually be like I was reading Playboy. It was like it was hitting the same synapses as my magazines were.
And that's very interesting because I talk about this quite often. Specifically, I have a couple interviews with rape survivors and victims, predominantly at a young age, at the ages of 2, 3, 4, and it's not uncommon to heal these traumas through sexual exploration. Especially childhood sexual abuse. There's a term called regressing. I think you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, because I actually have a quote unquote daughter who's a regressor, and I say quote unquote daughter because she's not my daughter, and I mean I met her in her 20s, so it's not like I'm gonna adopt her or anything, But she calls me dad. She calls my wife mom. Our relationship is weird. And I wasn't about to be saying, well, my daughter and I actually talk way more about this stuff than my wife and I do, because my wife doesn't have that sexual trauma stuff going on. So my daughter and I talk way more about the intricacies of this stuff. I mean, she and I couldn't have a more close daughter to me than her. You know what I mean? Like, we're goofy. It's like I raised her my dang self, So we talk a lot about all this stuff.
I do want to say too, just in case, if anybody who's listening does not know what regression is, and as I mentioned earlier with childhood sexual abuse, this woman in particular is talking about another woman who he actually offered me the chance to ask her to be interviewed about a woman who was had a miscarriage at the age of 9. So you could imagine what comes with that. With these abuses that happen in childhood, a regression is the act of acting as a child during intercourse to kind of almost relive the events and have a form of control in a form of...
It's not specifically intercourse, though. age regression is actually, most people would argue it should be non-sexual. The woman I know almost always operates at a certain age under what her real age is. That age that she is depends on what's going on in her life, like the amount of stress or the amount of anxiety, or if she's sick, or whatever's going on. Like I said, depending who you talk to as far as professionals, depends on should you have intercourse when you're regressing or not, because it can help and it can hurt.
And that's interesting too, and I really love how you expanded on this, because now I feel like I definitely learn a lot with every call that I have, but I feel like that has opened up my mind a lot more too with what you just said about like kind of like the levels to this. It definitely is facetious, and now that I think of it, it definitely an incorrect mode of thinking to think that this is only an intercourse thing, because I mean, again, like I said, there's layers to this, right? I'm sure that I can imagine how many times that probably just passes through her mind and your mind too, just on any given day. There's so many, what is it, over 13 million thoughts that you have in 12 hours or a whole day. I forget the exact number, I could be incorrect. And a lot of those are things that have happened in the past, or I'm sure, please tell me if this is accurate or not. I'm sure that at some point, some days you wake up and you're probably just like, damn, my parents are brother and sister. Like, how do you not think of that? And I appreciate you spreading that knowledge. I'll definitely carry that and hold that with me. We're gonna come back to this this daughter relationship in 1 second. Did your siblings ever find out the nature of your birth parents?
Yeah, I mean, I don't hide it. So, I mean, I shouldn't say that. I don't it's not common knowledge like on my Facebook page or anything, but.
And how did they react, your siblings?
Like siblings, they give me crap about it. That's just my family. We're facetious.
Could you just give me like an example of something they might say, if it's not too personal?
Okay, so my younger sister, we would just start giving each other crap about stuff, and she'd be like, "Well, at least my parents weren't brother and sister," and I'd say, "Well, yeah, well, I was adopted. You were an accident." And then she'd say something else, and I'd be like, "Yeah, but you're gonna grow up to look like Dad." So,
On the subject of appearance, I don't know what you look like. I mean, it's very common whenever incest takes place, and a huge reason. Besides, let's set aside everything else. A big issue with it is the birth defects that it can cause to the child. Do you suffer any physical consequences as a result of the actions of your birth parents?
Nothing that can be like directly correlated to it. I mean, I have a few different health conditions, but they're not really any different than your average American. I don't have any like two-web feet or any, cleft lips or any, whatever. What's the other? Habsburg jaw. I don't have anything weird like that.
Do you consider yourself lucky in some sense?
Yeah, because part of the disclosure or whatever when I was adopted was mentally slow and stuff like that, and I hold a master's degree, and the last time I had my IQ test I was like 136. Well, I obviously didn't have that either, so those birth defects and anomalies and stuff happen. It can happen right away, especially if you're brother sister, the closer you're related, but they're more likely with each generation of incest, which is why you hear about like King Tut and his club feet and all his birth defects because of all the rampant royal incest going on at the time. I'd say I'm severely lucky.
Tell me a little bit about like, you're in middle school, you find this out. Let's skip to about, mention this porn addiction to the depression, anxiety. Let's skip to about, your midlife, 20s, 30s-ish. Generally summarized. How are you handling this information and kind of going through life?
Well, even back in the 20s, even the teens and 20s, it was part of me. It was just like now, it's just in the back of my head. It wasn't something I fixated on. Porn addiction was worse for me than this knowledge. There was a point in my 20s where I was unemployed for a long time, living off my parents, didn't really want to do anything, didn't really have a direction in life. I would quit a job whenever I got sick of it and look for another one. A lot of it was addiction, and just no different than if you're an alcoholic or a drug addict or whatever. I was so, you couldn't count on me. I was just non-existent basically. Now I gotta do math again. 24, when I was 24, my little sister, the biological one, she got killed in a car accident. at 16. And so that kicked my butt to go back to college. And so I went back to college, got an associate degree, graphic design, got a job, still had the addiction and still had, all the anxiety and inner turmoil and all that stuff. But I was actually like doing something with my life for once. Remarried in 33 and been married ever since.
You got your master's in graphic design too, right?
No, my master's is in seminary, Master of Divinity.
I actually don't know what that is or means. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so seminary is where you go to school to be a pastor. So I went to school to be a pastor, and I'm not doing anything with it right now. But if I got ordained through some denomination, I could be a pastor of a church.
This is so interesting because we got God,
I know.
porn, tragedy,
Age regression.
yeah, like, and on top of that, we're laughing too. Like, you wouldn't think you'd be laughing during, like, with any of these topics being brought up at all.
If I don't laugh, I'll cry. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
you do have to, like, release the tension.
I have such a dark sense of humor. People, like, I'm the guy who goes too far. There's 5 people telling jokes. It is like, oh, hey. It's probably because I have all these things in my head that I'm always thinking anyway. So to me, it's like, whatever.
Why did you pick seminary?
Well, the short answer that any seminarian should give you is God told me to. But so after my sister died, you pretty much either get closer to God or further away from God. My mom took the path of getting closer to God. Like I said, we grew up going to church every Sunday, but home, we didn't pray at home. We didn't do daily devotionals. We didn't do any of that stuff. It's like, okay, church is something you have to do. After my sister died, I'm knee deep in my addiction and just trying to get through college and everything. And I really didn't care one way or the other about church. Mom, every time we got together, she'd be like, you should go back to church. You should go back to church. And I stopped even talking to her for a little while, even though we're rent for, my house, because every time we got together, it always went back, you should go back to church. And eventually it worked. I think, I want to say about 10 years or so after, well, maybe 8 after she died, I'm still in my addiction and everything. But I'm trying to get my life better. I'm trying to get back on track and everything. My mom said, oh, well, take you out for breakfast on Sunday. And I said, well, what time is church over? And she said, oh, you're going to church with me. It's like, okay. And being broke, it's like, okay, free meal, whatever. I don't care. Be a one-off kind of thing. Well, the church we went to was the church I grew up in. It's a rural church, so everybody knows you anyway. And so, yeah, it was, oh, I haven't seen you in years. And, it was all this reminiscing and recollection and all that kind of stuff. And so, which is a double-edged sword because it makes you feel good. But when you're an addict and anxious and depressed, like the last thing you want is to remember and be around people who think you're a good person. So, yeah, it was weird. But then when the service started, there was this thing in my head that came back actually when I was a teenager. I always thought I should be a pastor and just dismissed it. Well, the first Sunday I was there, back after years of being in church, the same voice came back and said, you should do this. You need to do this. I would start going to church every week. At the time I was unemployed because I had gotten fired because of my porn addiction from my graphic design job. And so I'm like, well, I got time to volunteer, so I'll volunteer. So I started volunteering at the church and going every Sunday to church and talking to the pastor on different things. And plus, I was 12-step program for my addiction. So there was that service and that higher power and all that discussion at group coupled with my religion.
I kind of want to ask you, and this is, I suppose, quite a bit of a philosophical question, and I kind of want to tie this back in again to your parents and this tragedy that you suffered with the loss of your sister. What, in your interpretations, what is God?
God is the all-powerful creator of the universe. I don't know what else to say. He's the end all be all, the Alpha and Omega, the Father. I'm a Christian, so I believe Father, Son, Spirit, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, the Trinity. Essentially, he's the end all be all of everything that, we see or experience.
You said earlier when you suffer these these tragedies, you either get further from, again, God, everything, the creator of everything. You get further from the creator or closer to the creator. And I actually had read a book by Harold S. Kushner, who was a rabbi, and he lost his daughter at the age of 3 or 4, I believe. I could be incorrect, in a car accident. I think the book is titled "When Bad Things Happen to Good People." What do you make of the creator orchestrating this? I mean, I wouldn't say orchestrate. I don't know if that's the right word to use here, but in some sense, I mean, the creator would have known about this and in some way, shape, or form, foreseen this to happen. In your interpretations, what do you make of that?
That depends on the day also. Because there's different schools of thought. If God's omnipotent, then he's not all powerful because good things happen. Or if he's all powerful, then he's not omnipotent. There's layers that I have yet to reconcile. People who spend a lot more time and are a lot smarter than me spent decades, centuries, millennia trying to reconcile. I don't know. Did he know my sister was going to die? That we were only going to have 16 years with her? Maybe. But I don't know how to reconcile that myself because, well, let's put it this way. I wish I knew her name, but years ago, there was a high-profile kidnapping case, I think, in Colorado. And they found one of the girls, and they were on Today's Show. They had the parents of the girl who was found on with parents of another girl who was either killed or not found, one of the two. And the ones whose kids were found, or whose daughter was found, said, we just thank God for hearing our prayers and bringing her back to us, and all that stuff that they always say. And the other, I don't remember his mom or dad, but one of the other parents said, well, I guess our prayers weren't important enough. So it's, how do you reconcile that? I don't know. I'm gonna find out when I get to heaven and ask him. Really, I don't know how his mind works, and I'm not about to put words in his mouth or anything. So I know my dad never went to church that I knew of growing up, so Christmas. So for him he really couldn't get farther away from God, but he stayed far away from God for a while. And like I said, my mom pretty much got numb. So God's motivation and all that stuff, I have no idea.
And this can be applied, and it absolutely can be applied in your case, not only with your sister, and of course too with a circumstance, at your birth, with your parents being brother and sister. That's not
right.
These are two huge events, both in and of themselves, that can have significant repercussions on a person's ego, persona, sense of self, masculine and feminine energies, everything. Everything is everything.
Right.
I talk to a lot of people who suffered a lot of crazy things, and I do like to ask them about God because I think I'm very blessed. I dare say I've been very lucky, I feel like, throughout my life, but it's still something that's on my mind constantly, that even though I'm here living a decent life, there are people who are like you who have suffered these things. There are people who are literally enslaved in Libya. I think of genocide, Holocaust, Rwandan genocide, these things. And I know that the world is not inherently, I suppose, a morally or good or fair place. So I did want to hear your opinion on that as somebody who studied seminary. And it's interesting too that you study this and there's still there seems to be no concrete answer, right?
There's just some things we're not meant to know. But yeah, just read the Bible. There's incest in the Bible, clearly. There's, everything. There's murder. It's not a it's for work book.
I know what you're talking about. It's a crazy book.
But it's like, okay, well, the one that always stands out to me, I don't use this to discount the Bible or anything like that. It's just an interesting thing that I see is, so King David had a load of children. Obviously, because we always hear about it, adultery is one of the biggest sins of the Bible. You don't do it. King David, after he has all these sons and multiple wives and concubines and all this stuff, it's still not enough. And he sees somebody bathing out in the moonlight across the way or wherever she was bathing on the rooftop, and has sex with her. She gets pregnant, so nobody knows, because his husband's off in battle. So it's like, oh, well, she got pregnant, and he's, what's up? Well, then he sends this guy off to get killed after he comes back to her. So it's like, oh, well, I don't have to worry about whose son is this. Anyway, he commits adultery with Bathsheba. gets, her husband killed in battle, and then she gives birth to a son, commits all these sins in relation to this, and he's got all these other kids who supposedly would be in line for the throne, and God chooses this son to be the heir to the throne instead of all the other sons. Again, that's where I go with God's sovereignty. Why is the one in adultery the one who's chosen to be the next leader of Israel? I don't know. Like I said, I don't use that to discredit the Bible, because it's still God's book. But at the same time, it's like, okay, so if adultery's wrong and there's all these other sons in front of him, why is this one all of a sudden? And everybody's heard of King Solomon. I shouldn't say everybody, but most people, Christian or not, have heard something about King Solomon being the big king of Egypt or of Israel. And so it's like, okay, so why him with the adultery and all that stuff? I don't know.
In the song Fear by Kendrick Lamar, he talks about, there's a second verse in it where he goes, why God, or there's a chorus in the second verse where it goes, and I quote, why God, do I have to suffer? What do you make of we just talked about the tragedy that happened to your sister, and then have you ever asked yourself, why did God make me have the parents that are brother and sister? Is this a question too that, you find yourself just having no answer for?
Other than the very general, he just needs me to do something or reach someone. So even before I knew my parents, even before I knew my birth parents, there was something that, so with my addiction, I could have been in prison, I could have been dead, I could have been registered, all these things. And there was always something that saved me from all that stuff. Yeah, I get fired, but I never got prosecuted for doing stuff in public or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, none of that. And I've met people in my 12-step program who searched the wrong thing the one time and they got pegged. So there was always this, okay, what am I being singled out for? And then I met my parents, or met my birth mother, and heard the story of my birth, and my wife and I were both like, okay, so I'm literally here. I mean, we're at being both Christians, we're obviously going to look or see the God picked us thing part of it. And so there was like, oh, somebody is watching out for me. Like, I literally could be dead. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it's always felt like there's something that's been helping me more than hurting me.
Yes, and I know what you're talking about. Even if whoever's listening to the call, if you present as atheist, or if you don't believe in any type of spiritual essence, whatever it may be, whatever, I think that even just the notion of like karma, in essence, doing good things, like this is a universally felt experience. I think that sometimes when bad things, sometimes, and I say that, I don't mean every time, I say sometimes, when bad things happen to me, even I'll think of something bad that I did maybe like a couple of years or weeks ago, and I'll be like, you know what, fair. Or sometimes something bad will happen to me and I'll make a connection to something I've done before. It just clicks in your brain and it's a different feeling. I can't speak on other things that are at a certain level that I cannot speak on, I have not experienced, but some things, yes. Talking about the story of your birth, really, in essence, what explanation did your birth mother give you?
Okay, so let me preface this by saying I hate my birth mother. Now, hate is a strong word, but she's toxic. I haven't talked to her since, and she always blames someone else. You know what I mean? It's like, that's a whole kettle of fish I don't want to get into right now, but I just needed to say that, to say this is her story, so who knows. I asked her about the relationship, and she didn't say it was non-consensual, but she didn't say it was a one-time thing or not. I don't know if it was repeated. I don't know anything. In essence, she said, well, that's what happens when you grow up with an overbearing mother. So you're going to assume pretty much probably the same thing I'm going to assume. How does one relate to the other? I don't know if it was, if I can't go out and have sex with boys, I'm going to have sex with my brother. I don't know. I don't honestly even know which one was older. But paperwork says one thing and my mom says something else. So I don't know who was the older participant here, or anything. But she did tell me that nobody knew she was pregnant. So she went 9 months, give or take, with a nurse mother who didn't know she was pregnant.
I've heard some stories about that, actually. My mother actually tells me quite frequently that people use like waist trainers to like hide and somehow it actually works. But the nurse mother thing definitely adds another layer to this, but continue.
But if you don't really care what's going on in your house, or or have denial, whatever, like, oh, not my daughter, kind of thing, then you're going to see what you want to see. So I don't know. So apparently she never had any care or anything while I was in vitro or whatever, however you say it. Her plan was to call in sick from school on the day I was born, which she did. She was going to have me and then throw me in the creek behind the house. So no one would ever know she was ever pregnant. And then grandma happens to come home early that day from work while she's still in labor.
Is she doing this by herself, the labor?
That's what she told me.
Oh, I was going to say, how is that possible? But you know what? How isn't it possible at this point?
Grandma comes home, mom's in labor, and I don't even want to know how that conversation went. But they basically put her in the car, got to the doctor's office, and I was born in the doctor's office. The nurses took me away immediately, put me in the system, and grandma made them file adoption papers and all that stuff like right away. I don't know when grandma knew about who the father was. I don't know that any of that part at all. And my mother tells me this the only day we ever met. So that's what I was referring to when my mom were leaving the meeting with my mom of, oh, so if God didn't intervene.
Yeah. I definitely see what you're saying. Weird things, right? Weird things.
Yeah.
It's weird times. You just never know. Okay, because look, I would imagine if I walked up to my birth mother and she was like, yeah, I was going to murder you. And she doesn't sound very apologetic or redeemable based off of most of the things you said. Where do you place blame and responsibility? Do you place it on her? Do you place it on the household that she grew up in? Do you place it on the time? Do you place it on, how do you go about this?
Well, I'm not sure what the time has to do with it. I mean, it's 78, 79. So it's not like it was 100 years ago, or it's not like it was 10 years ago. So, it's the time, I guess it is what it is. As far as everything else, I don't know. I don't know what overbearing mother means. Overbearing mothers I've known, it's not really dawned on their children to have sex with each other. So I don't have any clue how it got in either of their heads. I never met my dad because he died 2 years before I knew any of this, like names and stuff. So to meet him, or I did have contact with one of his daughters very briefly, like one message on Facebook. But yeah, I can't speak to that at all. Who, how, when, why.
I think you had also mentioned the fact that you had visited a grandmother.
Great grandmother. Yeah.
How was your experience when you visited her?
Poor. But that had nothing to do with her. She's a sweetheart. Okay, so my wife and I, we just got married, and we were over at my mom and dad's house, and I brought up the adoption stuff, and mom's like, oh, I think I have the paperwork. Now, granted, she's known I was looking for my parents for years, or wanted to. She never once brought up anything about having paperwork. There's a whole bunch of questions I have about that, too. Anyway, she gives us this file that they had from when I was adopted. And my wife and I started going through it at home that night. Funny thing about 70s closed adoptions, they printed off the paperwork and then they decided, oh, well, you can't put names in there, so let's get a Sharpie. And so they'd black out the names with a black Sharpie. Now, the funny part is they'd black out the first name. On the second page, they'd black out the last name. So if you just put 2 and 2 together and actually read the forms, you can put stuff together. I think in one of them we had to, hold it up to the light, but you could still make out the printed ink under the Sharpie ink. So, and of course, being brother and sister, obviously you find one, you're going to find the other one. So we found my dad's obituary first, and then of course, survived by, and it has sisters' names. And so we found her, and I mean, we spent way longer looking for these people than we should have, because it was like 2 a.m. when we got to bed. I don't remember if it was that night or soon after, but I found my mother on Facebook, and I sent her a message. I don't remember how I worded or anything, but I just forgot about it for every fiber of my being, saying, did she see it? Did she see it? I didn't want to respond, because I'm like, it's in her court. She can do with it what she wants. So a year later, I got a message from her, and like totally forgot I even sent this message, and because that long ago, and me forcing myself not to respond, it was out of my head. And all of a sudden I get this message from this person. I have no idea who it is. And we start talking or whatever. And my wife and her ended up setting up this meeting. Well, she lived in a different state. So she was going to come for some convention or whatever. And her and my wife set up this time to meet in near where my parents grew up.
And again, just to make sure, this is your great grandmother that's visiting a convention, or did I get?
No, my great grandmother lives in my state, and my mother lives out of state.
Okay.
So
okay.
she was coming to a convention in our state, and it was around the time of great grandma's birthday.
Can I ask what convention?
It was something with their denomination.
Air denomination?
No, her denomination. I don't want to get into that because I don't believe it's a denomination. But anyway, that's a whole different kettle of fish that, I don't want to get into. Anyway, they have some yearly convention thing in Minnesota. And so my mom and one of her daughters were coming for that. And like I said, it just happened to be around the time of my great-grandmother's birthday, the 90th, 95th, whatever it was. And so my wife's and my understanding was that we were going to meet my mother and my great-grandmother and talk and reminisce or whatever you want to call it. And that was it. So we drive the 3-4 hours to this meeting, and my mom is there with one of her daughters and her kids. And then my other sister shows up. So now it's mom, 2 daughters, 2 nieces, nephews, and I'm meeting my great-grandmother. We go to the senior facility where my great-grandmother's apartment is. And it's basically, other than the bedroom and bathroom, it's basically one big room. And so all the kids are playing in the living room. Grandma's sitting in her rocking chair, and, they're all scattered wherever. Well, the only place there was for my wife and I to sit was in the kitchen at a table. And my wife even spent the time making a cake for this, because my wife's a baker, for a hobby.
So this is like a really, would you describe this as awkward?
Well, it was very off-putting. I'm here with decades of questions, and I ain't about to bring it up in front of, however old these kids were, like toddler age, whatever, or great-grandma, I mean. So it's like, I was hoping for one-on-one time, and no, we met at a coffee shop, like Caribou or something, and went to her place, like, right away. So there was no real meet and greet time. This whole time we're there, we ended up going out to eat and stuff like that, but still, it wasn't like what I envisioned. The whole time we're in the apartment, my wife and I are basically sitting at the kitchen table with the cake in front of us, just sitting there going, oh yeah, I don't know who that person is, because they're talking about growing up and what's happened to this person and how this, and my wife and I just keep looking at each other going, why are we here? But I'm assuming you're wondering, okay, when did you have this conversation about the creek and all that? So as we're leaving,
bro,
my mother and I and whatever, we're all leaving at the same time. And so we're out in the parking lot, and she's like, oh, I have something for you. And I was like, okay. And she gives me my grandfather's leather jacket. It's like, okay, whatever. Like, he died like a year before, so I didn't know the guy either. I'm never going to meet the guy, whatever, so it's like, okay, didn't even know what size I was, and you're going to give me some random leather jacket, whatever. And then she, I don't remember what else we talked about, but that's when she told me about the whole how I was born thing, and I was like, oh. And then it's like, okay, let's drive the 3 hours home now. So
when you were driving home, were you?
Oh, my wife and I had conversations. It was not.
Were you yelling? Were you hitting stuff? Honestly, I would definitely be in a mood. Once you said as we were leaving, what would you describe the emotions you were feeling to be?
Well, first it was awe. Like, not even awesome. It was more like, how the hell can you tell someone that? Like, first of all, take the relationship out at all. If I grew up with the woman as my mother and I found that out, I'd still be thinking, how the hell can you tell me that? Let alone, then you add in all the other stuff and then say, oh, this is the first time we ever met in person and you're telling me that. Yeah, the sheer, like, audacity of her to tell me this in that context was like just like now, where I keep bringing it up and then laughing about it. That's kind of how it was. Like my wife and I would be silent for, I don't know, 5-10 minutes, whatever, and then all of a sudden it'd be like, how do you tell someone that? Like just out of the blue, I'd be like, what the hell? My wife and I still can't believe that part of it. And since then there's been other OMG moments that it's like I don't get it. That whole family's messed up, in my opinion, and it's sad because it's like, I kind of wish I'd never met them, but at the same time, then I'd still be wondering what kind of people they are. So it's the double-edged sword of, do you meet them or not meet them? Is knowledge better than wonder?
Do you think that they're on some level, like, do you think they're mentally ill?
There's no question in my mind.
It would likely be a long list of, or more than one diagnosis, probably, for your mother, at least, to say.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. But I'm not about to, give them clinical diagnoses.
Yeah.
Just the level of denial and blame shifting in that family. So I asked her if I could meet my dad's family, because I don't know these people. And he had 3 kids and she had 3 kids. And so it's like, well, I know these brothers and sisters. Shouldn't I be able to know these brothers and sisters? And she started in on me like, oh no, you can't. No, I can't talk to them or whatever. Well, she and the ex-wife weren't exactly best friends, or not ex. See, that's another problem. I heard somewhere she was divorced, but in the obituary, their label is still married. So who knows? But anyway, she and my dad's wife were not like best of friends, talk all the time, anything either. So they didn't have a relationship. So she wasn't about to contact the lady because she didn't know what she knew about me, if dad had told her ever in their marriage or anything. And so she didn't want to open that kettle of fish. So eventually
so she never even owned. Wow.
Trust me, it gets better. So my wife and I were like, okay, what can we do? I can't contact, without knowing what she knows. I can't really contact her and say, hey, your husband is my dad, and and of course me having anxiety and all this stuff, like it just is eating at me going, how can we contact this family? Eventually she says, well, your sister, so my dad's oldest daughter in that relationship, she's 20. So you could talk to her without having to go through the mom. And I was like, oh, interesting. So I message her again on Facebook. And I tell her who I am and what's going on and everything. With my mom, I put it out of my mind because it's in her court, whatever. And I don't remember how long ago or how long it was. But eventually, we're talking months, she responds to me. And she's like, she's glad she found this out after her dad died, because she wouldn't be able to look him in the face anymore. She spent a long time being mad at God for how could this happen. She been all this stuff, and then she says to me in this message, she says, I accept you as my brother, but I don't think I'll ever tell my brothers about you. If and when I'll ever tell my brothers about you. And so of course I'm really pissed off because I didn't respond to this at all. But I said to my wife, okay, so you're pissed off at the deniability of your family and how everybody blames everything else on everybody else, and how you accept me as your brother, but you're not going to tell your brothers about me because, okay, so you're mad at your family for how they act, but now you're perpetuating the same behavior. You can't accept me as your brother and then not accept me as your brother. You can't know all this stuff and then sweep it under the rug and then be mad at your family for sweeping everything under the rug.
That's a whole nother level that I didn't think about, is that your mother is your sister. To some in some sense. I mean, like these like roles, brother, sister, mom, dad, these roles are like kind of like binary, if that makes sense, generally speaking. You know, the descriptions of these roles vary from culture to culture, but
I had a friend who always joked with me. He's like, "Good old Uncle Dad." You know, that's because that's what it is. It's like if only my mother's part of the family knew who I was, then my dad's family, I'm cousins. You know.
that's so, like I
So-
never even thought of that. Like
Yeah, it's murky.
your mother is your mom because she gave birth to you, but
Right.
I mean, you know, she had sex with her brother, and I guess your brother to have you. Do you ever see her as like a sister? Does that make
She wouldn't be a sister. She'd be an aunt. You okay there, buddy?
Yes. Dude, I can't imagine the trains of thought you've had about this.
So here's the other thing that floors me. You know, with the whole, you know, okay, so after I contacted my sister from, you know, my dad's daughter, after I contacted her, the freaking family blew up at me on Facebook. It was like, oh my God, how can you do that? How can you, you know? So my mom was like, you know, I told you should go through me. You should, I'm like, you didn't want to. Well, I would have been able to, or, you know, talk to her mom. And I said, you didn't want to talk to her mom. You left it up to me. And she said, well, you know, her mom could have talked to her about it. I'm like, how is her mom going to tell her anything different than what I did if she even knew about it? Well, moms know. I'm like, whatever. That's bullshit. I don't understand. So anyway, I had other like my aunt, who actually I have a decent relationship with, even though we never talked. But her and I have an understanding, at least, that I don't have with everybody else in the family. But she contacted me once, and she's like, "You should have let her deal with it." And I said, "She didn't want to." Well, it was her sin to confess. I said, I know, it wasn't mine. Why am I confessing this? Oh, no, she confessed her sin to everyone who mattered. So, like, her husband knew about it and stuff like that. And I said, no, it matters to this wife of, you know, dad or whatever. She didn't buy that. And I'm like, well, it's not my sin. I'm the friggin' product of the relationship. It's not my sin to confess. So why did I have to confess her sin to someone I've never met? And so it was just a whole kettle of fish that I keep bringing up. But yeah, it's just, that's the level of stupidity in this family.
I think it's safe to say that when it comes to your mother's family, I don't think it's up to me to judge. I think that as we kind of both touched on, I think we both on some level fundamentally agree that there's some higher, something smarter, something greater.
Yeah.
So
thankfully there's something bigger than us to judge them.
yes, but I do think on some level we are all human. I don't judge, but I do think it's safe to say that these people who are in your mother, father's family, that this whole vein, you know, there's something sincerely wrong with them, generally speaking. I'm assuming you don't really keep contact with them, do you?
I'm friends with a few of them on Facebook, but I mean, we don't ever message each other or anything. The last time anybody really tried to message me, my aunt, a few years ago, spent a whole day trying to tell me I need to reconnect with my mother and reconcile and everything. And after 12, 14 hours of trying to convince me, she started going psychological on me. So she basically brought up psychological issues of shifting blame and stuff like that. And my wife was in the room. I just started laughing. She's like, what? I was like, she just talked to me about blaming other people. And my wife started laughing. And so she's telling me all these psychological things. I was like one for one on her, like, oh yeah, well, you haven't heard this. You haven't heard this. You know? And anyway, my last like nail in the coffin was because I was like, talk to her, you know. Well, I think you should apologize to her. I'm like, okay. So this is what went down, and I told her the whole story of the first night that my mom and I met, and the creek and all this stuff. She didn't know what the hell was going on. She didn't know anything about me until lot later. She didn't know anything about the pregnancy, telling her all this stuff about the creeps and how mom told me that the first day we met and all this stuff. And after a whole day of her telling me I need to reconcile, she says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Never mind." So she only knew there's this random person out there and isn't. And I told her why I'm not part of the family. And she's never brought it up since. So, like, we're friends on Facebook, but we don't like message a lot back and forth of, "Oh, we're doing this week and you should come over." It's
And beyond that, beyond some level of like reconnection or like whatever, like if I knew that this was present in some vein of my family, I would want to go speak to this person and at least have one in-depth conversation and offer some type of sympathy and empathy.
well, she did that after I told her what mom's role of this whole not being reconciled.
Okay, so there's a ray of sunshine somewhere.
Right. She's actually sane.
So I feel like I could take a breath.
Yeah. But as far as my sister's concerned, from that family, it's like, yeah, I mean, if you knew you had a brother if I knew I had a brother out there, which I do, wouldn't you want to say something to him? Like, wouldn't you even want to know? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't think, as far as I know, she's never told her two brothers about me because they've never tried to contact me or anything. And I'm on Facebook, so it would be easy enough to find. Even if you don't want to talk to me, how could you deny your brothers that option?
But I think in summation, it is safe to say that, I mean, it seems like you didn't really get any proper closure. I mean, really, when it comes to like that. And then even if you did get some type of like actual sane explanation, I'm sure that even then to some level there still wouldn't be some closure. I'm not sure if there ever is after. You had also mentioned you and your wife having like a bit of a weird relationship, I think, if that was the word. And I also think that you were talking about your quote unquote daughter, so to speak. So
Right.
I think based off this conversation, it seems as though, I mean, you know where you are, you know who you're dealing with when it comes to that side of the family. And I think that what's really important, and I'm sure you see this too, is you just kind of want to heal as much as you can and keep on living life. How does this daughter play into that? And how does that work?
To me, it works because of the way my mind works and the way my emotions work and everything. Like, I'm a lot more open-minded than my wife is. My wife is very black and white. She's not philosophical. She has a master's degree. She had me the philosophy classes to her because she couldn't get it. So she doesn't think like that. So when I've brought that I've only met her a few months ago, but she started calling me dad almost right away. She started calling her mom pretty much right away. And I told my wife this, and she's like, "It's a scam. She's in it for money. She blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, "No, she's not." So anyway, like, we're trying to get on the same page with that, but it's a whole different dynamic that is hard to explain. But when I talk to my daughter, she and I, like I said, we connect. Like, there's something about her and I that just works. And
You think this is God again?
yeah, I mean, I do.
Mm-hmm.
So, what we do with that relationship is our problem. And I had never even heard of this age regression anything until she told me about it. So, like, I wasn't looking for a daughter. I wasn't looking for that role to be a caregiver, all that stuff. Like, I wasn't looking for it. Obviously.
Is the relationship ever sexual in nature or no?
See, we don't live close to each other. Yes, the texts do get sexual. Okay, so when we first started talking, my wife is pretty much asexual, and I'm hyper, and like to the point my daughter thinks I have trauma. Like, I don't know if it was family trauma or this, knowing this stuff trauma or something. She thinks, based on the way my mind is, that I have something similar to her story that, yeah. Anyway, and of course my wife thinks that's nuts, but because she doesn't buy into all this stuff. But anyway, when I first met her, she had spent weeks wondering if she should even contact, because she has, because of her trauma, she has severe trust issues, and she has very severe uh, identity issues. Like, she doesn't think she's important enough to, she didn't want to waste my time. Didn't want to worry if I was going to accept her friend request or whatever you want, her chat request or whatever. So she spent all this time killing herself with anxiety and contacting me. And she did eventually. And she, as she said, it's 20 seconds of courage was what, was her sending me the first message. And of course, the way my mind works, the first thing I thought of was, does that make the other guy a pedophile? Like, that's how okay, so the person who would want to have sex with somebody who's regressed, he was just the person who's,
There's layers. I wouldn't.
Oh yeah,
I wouldn't
right.
immediately say that. I think it's a fair
That
question.
was right. That
Yes.
was my first thing, because like I said, I'd never heard of this before. She was 25 at the time, so I was like, okay, so yeah, you're legal, but if you're acting like a 4-year-old, that because when she acts like a 4-year-old, she talks like a 4-year-old, and boys, and reads 4-year-old books. You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, like there was that was like one of my first questions about it. But she's never been in an actual relationship, so it's not really that easy to say. So anyway, like, because of all her sexual trauma, I wasn't about to just say, oh yeah, I'm gonna sext you whenever I want, and no matter what age you are and whatever. And so, like, it took a lot of convincing for her to ever tell me that, or for me to ever want to be sexual with her, because to some level she's always somewhat regressed, even if it's mid-teens. It's evolved since then, and now it's to the point where she actually asked me one time if I would rape her, and I said, well, if you ask me to, it's not really rape, is it?
Yeah, consensual non-consent.
Right. Well, my thing was like, okay, well, first of all, I'm married. I mean, she knew that from day one, that I was married. I'm like, okay, why would you want, you're trying to get over this, so why would you want? And I don't know if it's justification, she actually trusts me. Like, she knows that I don't want to hurt her. She knows that I'm going to do anything I can for her. She knows that I'm going to help her. She knows that I respect her, that, all this stuff. But in her mind, because she's been raped I don't know how many times growing up, she wants to be raped when she's regressed, because she wants that my memory will take place of the other one, so she won't have like the nightmares, and because she'll have flashbacks. Some weeks she doesn't sleep hardly at all because flashback. And so she's hoping that so those sexual memories.
Would you consider the relationship that you have with your wife as open? Or I think that it's just, you have such a unique background, and it's interesting too, because you said that your wife thinks very black and white, but I think that your situation is just so gray. It requires critical analysis.
My whole life is gray, and she thinks in black and white, so that tells you how we live. She knows about my daughter, but she does not know about the sexual part of my daughter. So in my world, because look, between the porn addiction and where I came from, there's always been a little like, hey, if I have a daughter, is something going to happen? And so then I meet this 26-year-old woman who's pretty much exactly like I am, and who calls me dad, but I haven't grown up with her as a daughter, so it's not really like a daughter. So when I tell my wife, dude, she's my daughter, I treat her like a daughter. We talk like well, my wife doesn't exactly know what, hey, she's my daughter entails in my head.
Yes.
So
it requires a huge amount. This contemplation to even get to this point, to this level that we're at, requires months of thinking.
But my wife doesn't think in those terms anyway. Like, had screwed around on her mom, not family, it was like, mom's best friend or whatever, but they got divorced when she was young because of it. That's where part of her male trust issues come from and all this stuff. So I'm not about to be like, hey, I'm having sex with my daughter. It's like,
do you think that if you explain this to her, if you truly attempted a philosophical endeavor, man, I don't know if it's harmful for me to say this, but I think that from what I've seen, from what I've read, from what I have researched on this extremely complex topic, it does help people to have these relationships. I wouldn't want to encourage you to do something that's unethical in terms of the relationship of you and your wife. I would never
Right.
do that. But what I am saying is that this could be good for you. You're talking about the nightmares that your daughter has. I can't imagine how many nightmares you've had or how many,
So my daughter brought up, I forgot even how we got on this topic. She brought up that I have some trauma. I don't have a memory of trauma, so could it be there? Yeah. Could it not be? I don't know. Could it be just, the stuff you and I are talking about? Maybe. And maybe that's where some of this stuff comes from. I don't know. But we were talking about that one day, and somebody posted something about age regression and what to do if you're sexual. And if it's sexual, you should be, when you're not regressed, you should discuss how it was and stuff like that. And so I made the comment about, okay, well, what if she's always regressed? Which, like I said, my daughter is. And so after we got over the initial, do you want to get rid of me because I'm always regressed and I'm too much work? Like I said, low self-esteem and everything. I was like, no, that's not what I said at all. We were talking about how she's always regressed. Like, she said, well, when I talk to you, the oldest I get is like mid-teens. And I was like, well, I can't tell the difference between what a 26-year-old you sounds like and what a mid-teens you sounds like. So I wouldn't have known you were regressed. It's internal, like how she feels, And I said, to be honest, I've never felt like I was 43. There's people that I look at and go, you have a PhD or you have 6 kids and own your own house, and I only own my own house because my wife owned it when we met. I guess I always looked at it more like, oh, if I hadn't effed around in my 20s, maybe I'd have all that stuff too. The way her and I were talking about it is, I have some of the same thoughts that she has. So like, where she never feels in her 20s, I rarely feel like I'm even in my 20s yet. I don't feel my age, just like she doesn't feel her age. So the interesting dynamic of our relationship is, so I'm the caregiver. I mean, these are terms that people use for the, it's not usually dad, daughter, it's like caregiver little. She and I like, when I talk about daughter, I'll put in quotes daughter so they know it's not actual daughter and they know what it means. So I'm primary caregiver, meaning when she has problems, she comes to me. When she has, whatever, it's just like dad, daughter. When she's scared, she crawls in my lap. She'll say, snuggles daddy, whatever. 95% of the time, that's what it is. Whether she's 18 months or 18 years, that's our role or our relationship. However, since that conversation, I'm like, oh, age regression sounds really nice. And I'm like, I never knew that was a thing. Even though my mind worked that way, it didn't work that way. You know what I mean? Like, it never occurred to me to think as far as an age regressor, because I didn't know about it, And I just thought I was like this weirdo who thought I was a lot younger than I was, or am. So ever since that conversation, I don't bring it up to my wife because she doesn't buy into it with my daughter anyway, so she's not about to buy into it. If I'm having a bad day or stressed out or whatever, I can be my 4-year-old self. But the difference is she doesn't ever turn to like caregiver. She's more like older sister, if that makes any sense. So like, I don't want to get too far into, multiple personality, but basically, so I'd be her younger brother and our dad.
Yes, and I'd also like to add to anybody who's listening who might feel off-putted or like, I'm sure somebody will. I mean, we're all human. These things may be foreign ideas to somebody who has never really, leveled or dealt with this or thought about it in depth. But to some degree, as you're talking about with different personalities, I would urge whichever listener who's listening to see that it's not really that weird when you think about it, because to some level, when we're at work, we have a certain personality, and at school with our family, we present differently based off of socio-cultural ideas, based off of the setting, the context, who you're around, so what it may be. But when you add the literal brain damage that trauma, emotional trauma, and knowing that such information about yourself and having the revelations, it adds layers, and you need these layers to be able to grasp and deal with what happened. to you. And so I would hope and I would urge whoever's open-minded enough to listen intently with purpose to begin with to see that this is not really that far-fetched when you think about it. And
Thank you.
that's a good way to put it, right?
Yeah. I mean, forgot who said it, but basically, there's not one version of you. Everyone who knows you has a different version of you. So if you know 200 people and one you's walking around.
Yeah.
You know.
And then imagine, again,
Like-
all the stuff we talked about. Throw that in there. What do you get? Something much even more complex, right?
Right. And everybody has their own ways of dealing with it and coping. And, there's different ways of scar tissue, presenting itself. And in my daughter's case, like, that's just how when she gets overwhelmed, that's how it helps. So do what you got to do. The mind is going to survive somehow.
So I think I'm actually coming up on, I think this would be my last question, actually. If to anybody who's listening right now, after everything we've talked about, I still feel like there's so much more, but for the sake of time, what would you tell the listener on how to approach life in general?
Well, first of all, I want to get on a soapbox for a second and say, stop the effing jokes about inbreeding. Like, Alabama is like the first joke that everybody in America has to say. Shut up, okay? Shit happens. There's people out there who you would have no idea have that in their history, but you just have to make stupid ass comments because you're ignorant. I'm sick of those stupid jokes. You know what I mean? Like, you're not funny. But secondly, and I kind of say this to my wife too, there's always more out there than you know. And you don't even have to be talking about the deepest parts of the ocean or the farthest reaches of space. There's more inside us than you know. Just because you haven't heard of something doesn't mean it's not a real thing. Like me with my daughter. Before a few months ago, never heard of age regression in my life. Be open-minded, be willing to learn, and be kind. Because it's a heck of a lot easier to be kind than it is to be a dick. People are generally good. Even people like me who are completely off the rails, everybody deserves kindness and respect and just to be human. Just let people be and be human. And, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all.